British jets taking off from Cyprus for Yemen. Not an escalation, the UK government said, but a message to the Houthis to stop attacking ships in the Red Sea. Joining forces for the third time, the UK and US hit 36 targets, including underground weapons stores and anti-ship missile systems. The British government said the strikes, carried out at night to minimise the risk of civilian casualties, further degraded the Houthis' capabilities. The Iranian-backed movement is keen to show what it can still do. It released these pictures of military exercises, destroying mock Israeli and American targets. 1 week ago, 3 American soldiers were killed in a drone attack in Jordan, claimed by an Iranian-backed group. On Friday night, the US bombed Iranian targets in Iraq and Syria and says there is more to come.
This was the beginning of our response. There will be more steps. Some of those steps will be seen, some may not be seen, but there will be more action taken. The president, in being clear-eyed about that, has told his military commanders that they need to be positioned to respond to further attacks as well.
Some Middle East experts warn there'll be no resolution to the troubles in the Red Sea without an end to the troubles between Israel and Gaza.
We should be very clear that the current escalation in the Red Sea is entirely a product of the war in Gaza. How do we actually move towards de-escalation with the Houthis? How do we actually move, more importantly, towards restoring security to the Red Sea? It will not be via military action. Restoring stability and security in the Red Sea area will require a ceasefire in Gaza, and that should be the priority of the British government.
Israel's war with Hamas has been raging for 4 months. The military released this footage of soldiers somewhere in the Gaza Strip and claims it's destroyed most of Hamas's battalions. Last night, Israeli jets bombed central Gaza and Rafah, the city in the south where more than half the population has fled. Hamas says more than 100 people were killed, including a young boy, Ahmed Omran. The United Nations has warned Rafah is becoming a pressure cooker of despair. Mohammed says, "We need help ending this war. We're done. One day someone loses his brother, the next day he loses his mother." A draft deal for a temporary 2-month ceasefire in exchange for the phased release of Israeli hostages will be promoted by the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who left for the Middle East today. The US says the ball is in Hamas's court. It says it's still studying the proposal.
Well, as Britain is drawn further into the war in the Middle East, MPs are warning that the government must address shortages in military personnel and equipment. If not, they say the armed forces will not be ready to fight a high-intensity war. The Defence Select Committee says the military is consistently overstretched, with people leaving faster than they can be recruited. The Ministry of Defence says increasing recruitment and improving retention are absolute priorities. But just last month, General Sir Patrick Sanders, the head of the army, called for a volunteer citizen army ready to fight a land war. Well, let's talk more about this now with Lord Dannatt, himself a former head of the British Army. Thank you for joining us this evening. I just wanted to know, what do you make of those comments by the Defence Committee? Those are stark warnings, but warnings that you've been talking about for quite some time.
Well, yes, you're right. And it's depressing that the House of Commons Defence Committee has had to publish a report like this. But as you're suggesting, a number of us have been concerned for quite some time that we in this country are not spending sufficient of our national wealth on defence. And ever since the end of the Cold War, we've had peace dividend after peace dividend being taken and a steady reduction in the spending that we have made on defence, such that, as people are concerned now, that if we were to get into a protracted high-intensity conflict, we would just not have the resources to do it. We would not have the manpower, we'd not have the modern weaponry, and particularly we would not have the ammunition. And
if we look at retention, for example, recruiting 5 and losing 8, those are maths that just don't work. And how worrying is it if this trend can't be reversed?
Well, of course it's worrying. We've been in this situation before, and we have to take action to reverse it. Now, the reason that so many people are leaving, because the pressure that they're under of frequently repeated overseas deployments, that puts pressure on individuals, it puts pressure on their families, and people then choose to seek alternative employment. The other side of the equation is recruitment, and it's a fact that when the economy is buoyant, civilian employment is high, it is difficult for the armed forces to recruit. And here's an ironical thing. We're not actually engaged as British forces in a fight at the present moment. And when we're not involved in a conflict like that, it makes recruiting much more difficult. It's an ironical fact that when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, recruiting was much easier. So the government has got to think carefully how it's going to address this. And one thing that it should think about doing is looking at the level of pay which armed forces personnel receive, and that could make the offer of joining the armed forces and staying in the armed forces rather more attractive. These aren't issues that can be kicked down the can for too much longer.
We've heard this phrase where we've moved from post-war into pre-war from the Defence Secretary. What's your assessment of what we're seeing right now? We're just seeing developments and strikes every day, it seems.
Well, you're right. There is a danger that we get overly concerned and that we talk ourselves into a position of hysteria, if you like. But I think the principal argument that needs to be made and needs to be understood is that if we get involved in war, the cost of that would be disastrous. Yes, the cost of deterrence is also expensive, but we need to increase our spending on defence to increase our deterrent posture. Now, there are two major conflicts going on, one in the Middle East and one in Europe, one in Ukraine. The Middle East one is concerning for us, but what really matters to us is the situation in Europe, the situation in Ukraine. We must go on supporting the Ukrainians, and we must deter further aggression.
Lord Danner, I just wanted to know about, you've called for 3% GDP spending on defence in the middle of cost of living crisis and NHS waiting lists. How likely are the government to be listening to you right now?
Well, we've got a general election coming up. Normally there aren't any votes in defence, but I think at this election, issues of national security and defence will have to be addressed by both major political parties. And 3% on defence is frankly a minimum. During the Cold War, when we effectively deterred the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, we were spending 5% of GDP on defence. So I think if the future government is going to take our security at home and abroad seriously,
Lord Danner,
it's got to seriously consider thinking of increasing our defence spending.